Why did she keep hearing the screams, even after the patient stopped breathing? The fluorescent lights buzzed above Dr. Sarah Chen, slicing through the silence that always followed a failed resuscitation. She peeled off her blood-stained gloves for the third time that night, her hands trembling despite years of practice. The emergency room at Walter Reed Medical Center never slept, but tonight it felt heavier, the kind of night that stuck to your skin long after dawn. Outside, the hum of medevac helicopters drifted faintly through the hospital walls. Another convoy, another batch of wounded soldiers flown home from a war that had started to feel endless. Sarah had been here 8 years, a trauma surgeon with steady hands and a calm that her team depended on. She was known for it, the doctor who never gave up, the one who would fight death itself with a scalpel, her jaw set, her eyes unblinking. She saved hundreds, maybe thousands. But something inside her was starting to fracture. Every soldier who came through those double doors carried the same story told in different words. A sudden shot, a friend falling, a sniper no one could see, the helplessness of not knowing where death came from, and always the guilt of survival. Sarah listened, she stitched, she stabilized, and then when the room emptied, she washed her hands and stared into the mirror above the sink. Behind her reflection, the corridor lights flickered like ghosts. That night, a young Marine named Jackson was brought in, bleeding from his shoulder. The bullet had torn clean through muscle and bone. As Sarah worked to repair the damage, Jackson grabbed her wrist with his good hand. "Doc," he gasped, voice trembling with fury, "they got Thompson today." Sarah didn't look up. "Stay still, you're losing blood." "He was the best soldier I ever knew," Jackson whispered. "The sniper was 800 yards out. We couldn't even see him." Sarah tightened a suture. Jackson wasn't finished. "We need people who can fight them at their own game. People with steady hands, like yours." The words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. After Jackson was wheeled to recovery, Sarah walked out of the ER, through the silent halls, past the sleeping patients, and into the cold night. The stars above DC shimmered faintly, their light diffused by the haze. She leaned against the railing outside the staff entrance, still in her scrubs, and let the conversation replay again and again. People with steady hands. Her father used to say that, back when she was a girl in the mountains of Colorado, where the air was thin and the mornings smelled of pine and frost. They'd go hunting before sunrise, not for sport, but for patience. He taught her to breathe with the wind, to wait until her heartbeat matched the rhythm of the world. "Hunting, not about killing, Sarah," he'd said once, his weathered hands guiding hers on the rifle. "It's about respect. You take a life only when you understand the weight of it." Those lessons had made her a surgeon, but now they wouldn't let her rest. That night, under the dim parking lot lights, she realized something that both terrified and clarified her. She had spent 8 years saving lives, but maybe she could save more by stopping the ones who took them. It was a thought she couldn't unthink. Over the next weeks, Sarah read everything she could about military sniper programs. The rigorous selection, the sleepless training, the brutal washouts. It was madness for someone like her, an accomplished doctor with a stable career. But the more she read, the less crazy it sounded. She wasn't running from medicine. She was evolving it, preventing the wounds before they ever reached her table. Every night after her shifts, she sat at her small apartment desk, lit only by the glow of her laptop. Research papers, military forums, testimonials. Every click pulled her deeper into a world she didn't belong to and yet couldn't ignore. Her colleagues would never understand. Her friends would call it self-destruction. But Sarah Chen had always followed purpose, not permission. 3 months later, she signed her application to a classified military training program that recruited medical professionals for combat support and special operations. It was so secretive, she wasn't even sure if it officially existed. She sealed the envelope, her breath unsteady. It felt like cutting away a part of herself. The hospital badge, the clean coat, the world of sterile lights and beeping monitors, all of it was about to be replaced by sand, sweat, and silence. That night she stood in the ER one last time. The same lights buzzed overhead. The same stretchers rolled through. The same smell of antiseptic and blood. She worked her final shift with the same precision she always had. Only this time, she whispered a silent promise to every soldier she treated. I'll find the ones who hurt you. I'll stop them before they reach another like you. When dawn came, she mailed the application. Months later, when the acceptance letter arrived, her hands shook. The first line was brief. You are hereby selected for Special Operations Medical Sniper Assessment. She stared at the words until her heartbeat steadied. Then she exhaled. It had begun. The desert didn't care who you were before you arrived. At 0400, an alarm blared through the barracks at a classified training facility somewhere in Nevada. Sarah had been awake for an hour, staring at the ceiling. She swung her feet onto the cold floor and laced up her boots. Outside, the air was already hot. 12 candidates stood in a line. She was the only woman. A man with a sand-worn face and mirrored sunglasses stepped forward. Instructor Rodriguez, former SEAL sniper. His voice was gravel and disdain. You think patching holes makes you ready to stop bullets, he barked. Out here, nobody cares about your degrees or your fancy ER stories. Out here, it's the desert that decides who stays. No one moved. Rodriguez's gaze found her. Chen, you think you can protect a soldier before he bleeds out? Sarah's voice was steady, though her legs trembled. No, sir. I think I can learn to protect him before he gets shot, sir. A few candidates smirked. Rodriguez didn't. Let's see if you can learn to survive first. The next 2 weeks were designed to break them. 80-pound packs, 16-hour marches, 3 hours of sleep, 1 meal a day, temperatures that roasted skin by noon and froze breath by midnight. By day 3, 2 men quit. By day 5, another collapsed from dehydration. Sarah kept moving, her feet blistered, her hands bled, every muscle screamed. But she'd seen real suffering, men dying on operating tables, mothers holding photos of sons she couldn't save. This pain was different. It was clean, honest. The instructors didn't just test endurance, they tested judgment. During one exercise, she was placed in a mock urban environment and ordered to eliminate a target. Through her scope, she saw the problem instantly. Civilians surrounded the suspect. There was no clean shot. Take the shot, an instructor shouted through the radio. Sarah stayed silent. Her finger never touched the trigger. 47 minutes passed. The scenario ended. Rodriguez found her later. Why didn't you shoot? She met his eyes. Because that would make me what we're fighting against. He didn't reply, but for the first time he didn't yell. By day 8, only 6 candidates remained. Sarah was running on fumes. She'd lost 15 pounds. Her vision blurred from sleep deprivation. The world had narrowed to a single rhythm: step, breathe, survive. Then came the hallucinations, her father's voice, the faces of patients she couldn't save, even her own reflection in the scope, hunter or hunted, she didn't know. But she kept moving, because she saw Jackson, Thompson, every soldier whose name she remembered, everyone who didn't come home. They marched beside her in silence. The final test was called the Crucible. 1 bullet, 1 target, 10,200 yards, shifting winds. They'd been awake for 72 hours. 4 candidates missed. Sarah took her position. Her hands trembled. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She closed her eyes. Her father's voice whispered from memory. Shooting isn't about the gun, Sarah. It's about becoming still inside yourself. She opened her eyes, found that stillness. The world slowed. The wind, the dust, the pain gone. She squeezed the trigger. The sound cracked across the desert. When the dust cleared, the target had a perfect hole through its center. Rodriguez approached, his boots crunching in the sand. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, "Congratulations, Chen. You just earned the right to start training." Sarah almost laughed. 2 weeks of hell, and this was only the beginning. But as the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the dunes gold and crimson, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not pride, not victory. Purpose. For the first time since the hospital, she wasn't running from death. She was walking toward it, to stop it from taking anyone else. Why was she smiling while dragging herself through the dirt? The sun rose over the Nevada desert and the sand shimmered like liquid fire. Sarah Chen lay flat on her stomach, motionless, her ghillie suit blending into the dry brush. A fly buzzed near her eye. She didn't flinch. Not after 20 minutes, not after 3 hours. Again came the voice in her earpiece, calm, controlled, a tone that carried both patience and expectation. Master Sergeant Elias Williams, legendary Army sniper, 38 confirmed kills, 3 tour in Afghanistan. He was nothing like the brutal instructors from selection. He didn't scream, he didn't threaten, he simply watched, and somehow that was worse. "Forget everything you think you know about shooting," he'd told her that morning. "This isn't about hitting targets, it's about never being seen while you hit them." Sarah's lungs burned. Sweat rolled into her mouth. Somewhere behind her, Williams waited with binoculars, tracking her movement across open terrain. She had to move 50 yards without him noticing. 50 yards in 4 hours. Every inch was deliberate, every breath a calculation. She'd thought surgery required patience. This was a different kind of stillness, a stillness that hurt. When Williams finally spoke again, it startled her. "Stop." She froze. He appeared suddenly out of the brush, kneeling beside her position. She hadn't even heard him approach. His gaze swept over the terrain, then back to her. "Closer," he said. "You're learning." Sarah allowed herself one shallow breath of satisfaction. That night Williams debriefed her under the dim light of the barracks. "You're improving fast," he said, sipping from a dented metal mug. "But remember, your rifle isn't your weapon." Sarah frowned. "Then what is?" He looked up. "Your judgment. The best snipers aren't the ones who hit everything they aim at. They're the ones who know when not to shoot." Sarah didn't answer, but she understood. Over the next 6 months, Sarah's world shrank to the scope, the trigger, the wind, the heartbeat. The sterile halls of Walter Reed were gone. In their place, dust, heat, and silence. She learned to calculate bullet drop over miles, to account for humidity, altitude, even the Earth's rotation. Williams called it the math of mortality. A shot at 70 degrees might land true. The same shot at 40 could miss by inches. Inches that meant the difference between saving a soldier or losing one. Sarah filled notebook after notebook, formulas, wind charts, breathing patterns. Williams tested her constantly. "You've got the science down," he'd say. "Now let's see if your heart's as steady as your hands." They trained at dawn when the desert was still cool enough to breathe. She learned to fire from helicopters, from moving vehicles, from unstable platforms. She shot while hanging upside down from a harness, simulating disorientation. Every day ended with the same ritual, cleaning the rifle, carefully, methodically, like a surgeon prepping for another operation. And every night, she'd stare at her reflection in the weapon's steel. She looked different now, leaner, sharper, harder. But sometimes she missed the sound of monitors beeping, the small human noises of the ER. There were moments when guilt flickered, the thought that she was trading one form of life-saving for another that required ending lives. But then she'd remember Jackson, Thompson, the soldiers who never came home. This was how she'd protect them now. Camouflage and concealment came next. Williams turned her patience into a weapon. She spent 18 hours once, motionless, in a single patch of brush, while instructors scoured the area with binoculars trying to find her. Her body screamed for movement, her legs cramped. Insects crawled beneath her clothes, but she didn't move. Later, when they finally gave up searching, William stood beside her hidden position and nodded. "You'd be amazed," he said quietly, "how many people survive just because they learned to disappear." Sarah learned to use every shadow, every blade of grass. She moved inches at a time. She learned that even her heartbeat could give her away if it shook the rifle at the wrong moment. The desert became her classroom, the wind her instructor. Sometimes when she lay beneath the stars, she'd remember her father's words again, "Respect life." And she wondered what he'd think of her now. By month 4, her training shifted from patience to precision. Long-range marksmanship, 1-mile shots, 2-mile shots, hitting targets that took seconds for the bullet to reach. At those ranges, you didn't just aim, you predicted the future. She learned to feel the wind with her skin, to taste humidity in the air, to know distance by instinct. Williams taught her to use her medical knowledge differently now. "You know the body better than anyone," he said. "You know where it breaks." He called it the off switch. Brain stem, upper spine, heart. 3 points where a bullet could end a fight before it began. "Your job isn't a wound," he told her. "It's to remove the threat instantly. 1 shot, 1 kill." Sarah listened, but some nights those words echoed longer than they should have. She'd wake up from dreams where the line between operating table and rifle scope blurred. Scalpel or bullet? Save or end? What's the difference when both mean keeping someone else alive? The stalking phase nearly broke her. She had to approach within 200 yards of a trained observer, another sniper, without being detected. Each time she failed, she had to start over from twice the distance. She failed 7 times. 7 times crawling through sand that burned like fire, through thorns that shredded her elbows. 7 times feeling the humiliation of being spotted. On the 8th try, she moved slower than breath. Every shift of her body matched the wind. Every pause felt like eternity. When she finally took her simulated shot and heard the faint click of success, she felt nothing but relief. Williams found her after, grinning faintly. "You just learned the most important lesson of all," he said. "What's that?" "That victory never feels like victory. It just feels quiet." In her final test, Sarah faced the hardest thing yet herself. The night before graduation, Williams gave her a question instead of an assignment. "Why are you here, Chen?" She hesitated. "To protect people." "Plenty of ways to do that," he said. "Doctors protect people, medics, teachers. You chose something else. Why?" She looked out over the desert, where the horizon shimmered with heat and distance. "Because I got tired of saving people after it was already too late." William studied her for a long time. Then he nodded once. "That's a good reason. Just remember, every shot you take and every one you don't will define who you are." 6 months later, Sarah stood at the firing range for her final qualification. Distances from 300 to 1,600 yards. Variable winds, shifting light. One by one, she hit every target. Every shot perfect. When it was over, Williams approached her, his expression unreadable. "I've trained over 200 snipers," he said quietly. "You have the skill, the strength, and the discipline, but what makes you different is judgment. You know when not to pull the trigger." Sarah didn't answer, she just nodded. When the final report was signed, she was Dr. Sarah Chen anymore. She was Sergeant Chen, medical sniper, U.S. Army. The helicopter descended through pre-dawn darkness. The blades thundered over Afghanistan's jagged ridges. Sarah gripped her rifle case tightly, her knuckles pale under her gloves. 8 months of training behind her, a lifetime of change ahead. Captain Martinez, the SEAL team leader beside her, shouted over the noise. "We're going into Kunar province. 3 confirmed enemy snipers. You're hunting the hunters." She nodded. Martinez continued. "These aren't amateurs. They've been taking out patrols weekly. We lost 4 men last month alone. You'll be working with my team, eyes from above, protection from range." Sarah didn't reply. Her mind was already mapping the terrain, visualizing lines of fire, calculating range and wind before she'd even seen the valley. The helicopter dropped lower, buffeted by mountain air. As the landing light flickered on, Sarah looked out at the black peaks rising like teeth against the horizon. So this is where the stories end, she thought, and where mine begins. When her boots hit the ground, she felt the old stillness return, the one her father had taught her, the one that came before every choice that mattered. She looked up at the sky, then forward into the darkness. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a doctor pretending to be a soldier. She felt like both. A healer who had learned how to stop the bleeding before it ever began. Why did the world feel so quiet before the first shot was fired? The helicopter lifted away, vanishing into the thin mountain air. Dust swirled around Sarah's boots as the rotors faded into distance. Then, silence. Afghanistan's Kunar province stretched before her, mountains carved by centuries of wind and war, valleys veiled in shadow. To most, it was just barren land. To Sarah, it was a chessboard of danger and possibility. The forward operating base where she'd be stationed was small, temporary buildings surrounded by sandbags and razor wire. It smelled of diesel, dust, and fear. As she stepped inside, she could feel the eyes on her. SEALs, Rangers, and Special Forces soldiers, all of them seasoned. Their expressions didn't need words. She was new. She was different. Captain Martinez met her near the map table. "Intel says at least 3 enemy snipers operating within a 20-mile radius," he said, tracing a line on the map with a gloved finger. "They're ghosts, never seen, never caught. You're here to change that." Sarah nodded, calm but alert. Her rifle case rested against the table like a secret waiting to be revealed. She spent the next days buried in intel, topographical maps, satellite photos, ballistic data. She interviewed soldiers who'd been pinned down, survivors of encounters that ended with friends bleeding out beside them. Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran who'd survived 2 sniper attacks, sat with her one evening over instant coffee. "He's good," Rodriguez said quietly. "Too good. Moves after every shot. Knows the terrain like he was born from it." Sarah looked at the coordinates he'd marked. "If I were him," she murmured, "I'd choose here or here." Rodriguez raised a brow. "Why those?" "They overlook both patrol routes, and the wind funnels clean between the ridges. Perfect concealment." The soldier stared at her, then nodded slowly. "Guess we'll find out." Her first patrol came on a pale Tuesday morning. The light was sharp, the air thin. She moved with an Army Ranger unit conducting a sweep through a nearby valley, a route often ambushed. Her rifle weighed 30 pounds, but it felt heavier with expectation. The valley was deceptively beautiful. Terraced fields clung to mountainsides. A river shimmered below like a ribbon of glass. Every rock, every shadow could hide a rifle aimed at them. The patrol moved cautiously. Sarah stayed near the rear, scanning the ridgelines through her scope. She remembered every lesson Williams had drilled into her: patterns, contrast, unnatural geometry. For hours, nothing, just the whisper of wind and the crunch of boots on stone. Then, a single sharp crack. The soldier ahead of her fell instantly. No scream, just the sound of his body hitting dust. "Sniper!" someone shouted. Chaos erupted. Men dove for cover behind rocks and ditches. Sarah's heart hammered once, then steadied. Her training took over. Sound delay, echo direction, angle of entry. She processed it all in seconds. "Ridge northeast, 800 yards," she whispered to herself, adjusting her scope. Through the magnification, she scanned sector by sector. patient as stone. Then movement, a shimmer of light off metal, not much, just enough. Her scope locked onto a cluster of rocks where a pattern broke the landscape's rhythm. A hide, expertly built, but not perfect. She adjusted her breathing, slowing it until the rifle's crosshairs stopped trembling. The enemy sniper appeared, barely a silhouette, adjusting his rifle, unaware of her. A man in his 30s, beard, local garb, Russian-made Dragunov rifle. He had no idea she was watching him. For one long moment, time froze. Sarah's finger hovered over the trigger. She thought of the soldier bleeding behind her. She thought of every man she'd stitched up under fluorescent lights. And she thought of her father's voice, respect life, always. She exhaled slowly. The shot broke the silence. The recoil hit her shoulder like a heartbeat. Through her scope, she saw the man's body jerk once, then go still. Her breath caught in her throat. 847 yards, one bullet, one life. The call came through the radio seconds later. Target down, clear for evac. Sarah didn't move. She watched the still body in her scope for a long time. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like silence. Back at base, the mood was different. The Rangers were alive because of her. The wounded soldier had been evacuated and would survive. Martinez approached her near the comms tent that evening, the desert wind cutting through the wire fence. "Outstanding work," he said simply. "Textbook shot, you saved lives today." Sarah nodded but didn't answer. That night, as she cleaned her rifle, she noticed her hands trembling, not from fear, but from the strange, impossible weight of what she'd done. She remembered every time she'd held pressure on a wound, praying to keep a pulse alive. Now, for the first time, she had stopped a pulse, deliberately. In her notebook, she wrote 4 words before turning off the light. The cost of stillness. Word of her precision spread quickly through the ranks. A week later, new orders arrived. She was being reassigned to a classified unit, a joint task force that included Navy SEALs, Delta operators, and Marine Force recon. The kind of missions that didn't officially exist. When she arrived at the compound, she could feel the difference instantly. The way these men moved, measured, quiet, lethal. The air smelled of gun oil and dust. Master Chief Petty Officer Thompson, the SEAL team leader, met her in the briefing room. He looked at her file, then looked at her. "I've read your record," he said. "Good training, solid first kill. But understand this, one mistake out there and people die. Out here, you earn respect by keeping your team alive." Sarah nodded, "Understood, Chief." He leaned forward, studying her eyes. "We'll see." Their first mission together came fast. Target, a Taliban commander coordinating attacks across 3 provinces. High value, surrounded by bodyguards, always moving. They would infiltrate at night, 12 miles from the objective, on foot through steep, unstable terrain. Sarah's role, Overwatch sniper. She'd eliminate the commander with 1 shot, clear escape routes, and cover extraction. The insertion was brutal. No moonlight, just darkness, cold wind, and the heavy rhythm of boots on rock. Sarah carried 70 pounds of gear, her rifle case cutting into her shoulder. The climb took 8 hours through narrow ridges where one misstep meant death. By dawn, they reached their Overwatch position, 200 yards from the target compound. Sarah unfolded her bipod, set her scope, and studied the world below. The compound buzzed with activity, guards, vehicles, shadows moving through courtyards. The target would appear soon. She adjusted her rangefinder, 1,247 yards, crosswind moderate, elevation drop 30 meters. The sun climbed slowly over the peaks, bathing everything in amber light. Then movement. The commander stepped into view, flanked by 4 guards. Sarah recognized him instantly from the intel photos. Thompson's voice came through the radio. "You have a clear shot." Sarah's finger rested against the trigger guard. The target paused near a vehicle, checking his watch. A stationary profile, perfect. She exhaled once, found the stillness between heartbeats and fired. The sound reached them 2 seconds later. By then, the man was already down. Confirmed kill, Thompson's voice said calmly. Let's move. The team slipped away before the enemy could react, ghosting through the terrain like they'd never been there. But fate wasn't finished testing her that night. Halfway to extraction, a Taliban patrol appeared out of nowhere. 6 men with rifles, too close to avoid. Gunfire shattered the silence. The world erupted. Sarah dove behind a rock, returning fire with precision bursts. Her training took over, controlled breathing, measured aim. Her bullets found targets even in chaos. One by one, the patrol went down. When the last echo faded, her chest heaved, not from fear, from focus. They reached the extraction point 20 minutes later, all alive. The helicopter's downdraft whipped dust into spirals as Thompson approached her. His face, for once, wasn't unreadable. "Clean shot on the primary," he said, "and you kept your head in a firefight. Not bad, Chen." Sarah just nodded, but as she strapped into the helicopter, she allowed herself one silent breath of pride. Not because she'd killed, because she'd protected. Over the following months, she joined dozens of missions, each one more dangerous than the last. She learned that combat wasn't about glory. It was about control, the ability to stay calm when the world burned around you. Her team began to trust her. They no longer questioned the doctor-turned-sniper. Once, after a mission, Thompson handed her a canteen and said, "You're thinking like one of us now." Sarah smiled faintly. "I was always one of you," she said softly. "I just wore a different uniform before." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough." That night, Sarah stood outside the barracks, staring up at the stars. For the first time since the hospital, she felt peace. Not the kind that comes from stillness, but from purpose. Every mission, every shot, carried the same silent vow: to protect those who couldn't see the threat coming. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. But on this side of it, she had found her calling. Why did the quiet before a mission always feel louder than the gunfire that followed? The briefing room was dim, the air thick with tension and caffeine. Maps, satellite images, and tactical overlays covered the walls. Every face around the table was a professional killer, seasoned, deliberate, lethal. Sarah sat among them, calm but alert, her rifle case resting beside her chair. She still wore the calm expression of a doctor, though the eyes that had once studied heartbeats now studied wind charts and kill zones. Colonel Harrison stood at the head of the room. "We have confirmation," he said. "High-value target, Mahmoud al-Rashid, top-tier Taliban commander, responsible for over a dozen suicide attacks and hundreds of American deaths." A stillness settled across the room. Harrison's tone darkened. "Intel indicates he's planning something larger, something that could wipe out a forward operating base housing over 800 coalition soldiers." The map zoomed in, a mountainous compound deep in hostile territory. "We need him alive," Harrison said. "He knows too much to die." Sarah's jaw tightened. Alive. She preferred the clarity of lethal precision. This was the gray zone. Master Chief Thompson spoke next, his gravel voice steady. "Chen will be overwatch for the SEAL raid team. Range, 1,800 yards. That's the edge of your capabilities, Sergeant. Winds in that area are unpredictable, so you'll need perfect timing. And remember, your job isn't to eliminate al-Rashid. It's to clear the path. Guards only." Sarah nodded, though her mind was already spinning through variables. Altitude, air density, ballistic coefficient, temperature drop by nightfall. 1,800 yards, in the dark, with friendlies in motion. William's old words echoed in her mind. Your rifle isn't your weapon. Your judgment is. The next 48 hours were all preparation. Sarah barely slept. She studied the compound's layout until she could sketch it from memory. Every sentry tower, every likely route of approach, every possible angle of shot. She recalculated her dope charts until the numbers blurred. She practiced on a makeshift range at night, firing in shifting winds and low visibility. Her spotter for this mission was Sergeant First Class Garcia, a calm, methodical man with a dry sense of humor and decades of experience. "You're walking into hell with a math problem," he said, checking her scope alignment. "And the wind doesn't give partial credit." Sarah smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure we get an A." Garcia grinned. "You're definitely not regular Army." They launched during a storm. The helicopter cut through freezing rain and violent gusts, thunder rumbling across the peaks. Below them, jagged ridges flickered with lightning. Sarah sat beside Garcia, both secured by ropes as the aircraft hovered over a cliffside insertion point. "Ready," the crew chief shouted over the roar. Sarah looked at Garcia. He nodded. Together they rappelled into darkness. The ground was slick, the air thin, each breath burned. They moved 4 miles on foot, climbing, crawling, sliding through freezing mud, until they reached their overwatch position overlooking the compound. The storm cloaked them perfectly. It also made their mission nearly impossible. Garcia set up the spotting scope and checked the rangefinder. 1,800 yards on the dot, he whispered. Winds gusting 40, sometimes 50. Visibility's crap. Sarah adjusted her scope, her gloves stiff from the cold. "We've worked with worse." "Not by much." They settled in, checking comms with the assault team below. The SEALs were in position, waiting for the signal. Sarah's world shrank to the green haze of her night scope and the rhythmic hum of rain against her hood. At 200 hours, the operation began. Through the scope, she could see guards moving along the rooftops. Her job, eliminate them quietly in sequence to clear the assault team's approach. Garcia whispered wind readings adjusting in real time. Left 3.2 mils, gusting, hold steady. Sarah found her first target, rooftop guard packing slowly. She exhaled. The world fell silent. The storm, the wind, her heartbeat, all faded. The rifle cracked softly. The guard dropped without a sound. "Hit," Garcia confirmed. "Clean." The second target appeared near the compound gate. But this one was moving erratically, half obscured by a wall, crossing behind light and shadow. Sarah waited, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. Timing was everything. He turned. For half a second, his chest aligned perfectly with her reticle. She fired. The bullet sliced through 200 meters of wind, then vanished into the storm. 2 seconds later, the man fell. "Confirmed," Garcia said, though his voice carried unease. "His radio's live, they'll know soon." Within seconds, the compound erupted. Alarms, shouts, lights flickering on. So much for stealth. Gunfire erupted below as the SEALs breached. Tracers streaked through the night. Sarah's radio came alive with shouts. "Overwatch, we're pinned down, need support." Sarah's pulse didn't change. Her breathing stayed even. She shifted targets, windows, rooftops, doorways. One shot, one elimination. Her rifle became an extension of her heartbeat. Then, movement in the upper window of the main building. Garcia saw it first. "Possible HVT," he whispered. Sarah refocused her scope. Through the rain and chaos, she saw him. Mahmoud al-Rashid. The man responsible for countless deaths, the architect of pain. But he wasn't alone. 2 women stood near him, wives maybe. There were children huddled behind them. Al-Rashid was using them as shields. Garcia's voice tightened. "That's him, you have the shot." Sarah's finger hovered over the trigger. Her calculations ran automatically. Range, 1,942 yards. Wind, 43 mph variable. Required lead, 0.6 mils. She could do it. but the margin for error was smaller than the width of her thumbnail. "I can make it," she whispered. Garcia hesitated. "If you miss." "I know." The radio crackled again. "Overwatch, we need fire support now." The SEALs were trapped under heavy crossfire. Time was gone. Sarah stared through her scope at the flickering window. The man she could end, the innocents she might kill. For one heartbeat, she saw not al-Rashid, but the faces of her patients, the ones who'd trusted her to protect life. She lowered her rifle slightly. "Negative on shot," she said quietly. "Engaging hostile support only." Garcia blinked, surprised, but trusted her judgment. Together, they redirected fire toward enemy positions around the courtyard. Sarah fired 5 more times. 5 clean hits. 5 lives taken so others could live. Below, the SEALs surged forward, breaching the main building. "Target secured," the radio crackled. "HVT alive, mission success." Sarah leaned back, her body trembling from the release of tension. Garcia looked at her. "You just made the hardest call a sniper can make." Sarah nodded. Rain streaked across her face, cold and relentless. "Killing, easy," she murmured. "It's living with it that's hard." Back at base, the debrief was quiet. The mission was a complete success. Al-Rashid captured, several major attacks prevented, dozens of soldiers' lives saved. Thompson approached her after the briefing. "You had the shot," he said. "Why didn't you take it?" Sarah met his gaze. "Because I wasn't the only one in the crosshairs." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded. "A lot of snipers would have taken it anyway." "I know," she said softly. "That's why they don't last." Later that night, she sat alone cleaning her rifle, the rhythmic motion almost meditative. The rain outside had stopped. The desert was silent. Her reflection stared back from the polished steel, half doctor, half soldier, all contradiction. She trained for months to make impossible shots, but the hardest one she'd ever faced was the one she didn't take. For hours she sat there replaying the mission in her mind, the faces in that window, the calm that had guided her choice. In the end, she realized something she hadn't understood before. Being a sniper wasn't about death. It was about control, of the weapon, of the mind, of the soul. Anyone could pull a trigger. But restraint, that took a different kind of strength. When Thompson passed her in the hallway the next morning, he gave her a quiet nod of respect. No words, no salute, just acknowledgement. It was enough. Sarah Chen had finally learned what kind of sniper she truly was. As dawn crept over the mountains, painting the sky in pale gold, Sarah stepped outside and let the cold wind brush against her face. She thought of the hospital, of the lives she used to save one heartbeat at a time. Now she saved them from 1,000 yards away. Different tools, same purpose. Her father's words drifted back once more. Respect life, always. She closed her eyes. Sometimes she realized, respect didn't mean refusing to fight. It meant fighting with conscience. And in the silence that followed, as the desert breathed around her, she whispered the truth she'd finally come to understand. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Why did the thought of 3 lives hang in the air like a promise she couldn't break? The briefing room smelled of stale coffee and recycled air. Projected images of a compound scrolled across the screen, angles, guard posts, probable entry points. 3 hostages. One was a female aid worker, the others, 2 journalists who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Intelligence said they would be executed in 72 hours if nothing changed. Sarah listened to the words, let them land. She traced the compound's outline with her finger, memorizing distances in the way a surgeon learns anatomy, by touch, by repetition, until the map felt like flesh. The plan was surgical. Infiltrate, establish Overwatch nearly 2 kilometers away, eliminate 6 sentries simultaneously during a guard change, and allow the assault team a 90-second window to reach the hostages before the compound could react. 1,800 yards had once been a test. Now the range stretched farther, closer to 2,000. The environmental math changed. Wind became an adversary with moods. Temperature stole velocity. The margin for error shrank to whispers. Colonel Stevens' quiet voice filled the room. "This is narrow, precise. There's no second chance. The assault team cannot move until we remove the sentries. Sergeant Chen, you know what's at stake." She did. She felt the weight of it in the hollow at her sternum, the same place where fear sometimes nested, warm and persistent. It had taken her nights on the range and hunger in the desert and choices between conscience and expediency to arrive here. Now, the lives of strangers folded into the ledger of decisions she would make. Preparation was a ritual stripped of ceremony. Sarah worked through all plausible permutations in silence. She calculated shooting solutions for each of the 6 positions: angles, bullet drop, spin drift, crosswind differentials at each range. She prepared contingency transitions. She and Garcia rehearsed a fluid sequence, left to right, fart near, accounting for mirage and gusts that could shift in the space of a heartbeat. The unit's psychologist, Dr. Williams, met with her privately. He didn't ask about technique. He asked about the space beneath her decisions, the quiet that follows a correct but lethal choice. "You'll be carrying those faces forever," he said. "Make sure the ones you save are worth the ones you carry." She left without answering, walking outside where the cold air freshened her thoughts. The mission was not hypothetical. Somewhere in that mountain compound, 3 people counted down the hours of their lives. Sarah's hands showed the same thin tremor she sometimes felt during long operations, an echo of the responsibility in her fingers. Insertion came on a day the weather could not decide. Snow squalls rolled in restless sheets, visibility collapsing, then opening like curtains to brief blue. Helicopter pilots murmured into headsets, breathing through their teeth as they threaded the aircraft through ridgelines and ice. The team rappelled into a landscape that had no mercy for misstep. The slick rocks glittered with frost, and the wind bit at exposed skin. They moved quietly for hours, each step a negotiation with gravity. When they reached their overwatch, Sarah sat up beside Garcia. The cold stung her face, her breath clouded the optics. Garcia ran his spotter checks with a mechanic's calm. "Gusts up to 50 and they're turning on each other," he reported. "Visibility's marginal in squalls, intermittent otherwise. If the window opens, you'll have maybe a minute where all positions line up." She accepted the risk with the clinical calm of someone who'd practiced at the edge. Her fingers felt the rifle like a familiar instrument, an extension of both calculation and conscience. She breathed slow, finding that precious rhythm between heartbeats Williams had taught her to find. Each inhalation was a small victory over the body's betrayed instincts. The assault team moved into position below. The mountains swallowed their shadows. Through the scope, the compound appeared like a diorama, sentries packing, routine practice to muscle memory. For a heartbeat, the world shrunk to 6 blurry dots, 6 needled targets of threat dispersed around a courtyard that held a terrible potential. Then, as if signaled by the mountain itself, guard change began. The 6 sentries stepped into the perfect alignment. The brief, terrible geometry Sarah had rehearsed countless times. Winds licked across the valley, a complicated poem of direction and velocity. Each target resided in a slightly different wind bubble, and every bubble had its own opinion. She began. First shot far right. The bullet sang into the wind, a small inevitability. The sentry folded like a puppet with a severed string. Then second left center, followed by third further left. Garcia called wind corrections like a metronome. Left 2, hold, follow through. The interval between shots was a dance. The cadence was steady breath counts. Hold, exhale, break, shoulder, fire. 47 seconds, 6 shots, 6 sentries down. The assault team moved at once, becoming a blur of steel and purpose. The extraction plan hinged on those seconds. If Sarah faltered by inches or by timing, the hostages would not survive. 2,000 yards is too far for luck. It is a place of math and faith. Through the scope, she watched people she'd never meet again move through a doorway toward the hostages. She watched the assault team enter, clear, secure. And when the radio crackled the words she had been waiting for, hostages secured, extraction inbound, the relief punched through her ribs like light through ice. Back at base, the accolades arrived folded into formal language, the quiet thanks of men who knew better than to fawn. Colonel Stevens' voice in debrief carried a brittle edge of relief. "You saved 3 people today, Sergeant. Those 3 people had names, families, futures. Don't underestimate that." They did not celebrate. They were not in the habit of celebration. They tended to mend and move on, to file each success like armor patched at the seam. But alone that night, Sarah allowed herself a sliver of something that approached pride, an honest acknowledgement that the math in her head had turned into beating hearts somewhere else. And yet, even as recognition circulated, commendations, quiet nods from Thompson, a firm, respectful clap on the shoulder from Williams, another weather formed inside her. The equipment checklists and after-action reports could not fully account for what it felt like to have someone else's life hinge on a breath you took. She dreamed that night not of targets but of the hostages' eyes, a flinch of terror, then recognition, perhaps the brief, sinking disbelief when someone they did not know saved them. Faces like small lit windows against a dark sea. She woke with a weight in her mouth, the taste of cold metal and distant prayer. Word of the operation traveled up channels to places where colorless ribbons and typed commendations lived. Analysts studied the ballistics. Instructors across training centers dissected her methodology and timing. But the measure of success for Sarah was quieter. It was a name she'd scribbled on the back of a receipt that afternoon in the snow. Aisha, Tom, Mark. 3 names that would not be executed in a compound that morning. A journalist later tried to pin the moment into language. "You were perfect," he wrote in a piece that tried to make legend of precision. She read the article and put it aside. She could not make the word fit into the way she felt. Precision, yes, but not perfection. There was always the ache of what was carried, pictures in a folder of the people she'd killed and left behind like notes in a surgeon's chart, necessary interventions, outcomes decided by steadiness and calculation. Garcia found her one evening as the sun cut through the snow like a blade. He handed her a thermos of coffee, richer than the instant that often sustained them, and said, "They'll study that sequence for years. You did something rare out there." She took the thermos and stared at it, then at him. "Did we save 3 people?" she asked, neither rhetorical nor needy, plain fact needing witness. "You did," he replied, meeting her eyes. His voice had no flourish. It simply stated what the orbit of their work allowed them to see, cause and consequence. She let herself absorb the simplicity of it. The world resumed its usual pressure, logistics, new ops, briefings that never seemed to end. The medals and accolades existed, but they were not the ledger she kept. Her nights were still threaded with other calculations, the small daily reconciliations a person must make who chooses the calculus of life and death. Sometimes, when the camp lights dimmed and the mountain wind became a whisper, she would take out her notebook. Not the technical pages filled with numbers, but the tattered one where she wrote names. She pressed the paper flat and wrote down new names with the same quiet reverence she had once used to record a patient's unlikely recovery. The more she saved, the longer the list became, an odd kind of moral accounting. It did not absolve anything, it merely recorded the facts of consequence. Each name was both a triumph and a small, private burden. Being exceptional attracted attention. Invitations arrived, requests to join more classified missions, to be placed where the scale of risk and impact was disproportionately large. Thompson's voice tightened with a level of respect that bordered on deference. "When we have the impossible, we call you." That label, impossible, settled around her like a second coat. It was useful. It also insulated her from forgetting that each impossible task carried remnants, ghosts of the one she had to neutralize. The SEALs were no longer speechless. They were asking specifically for her when lives hung in the balance. That knowledge opened both doors and wounds. On rare quiet afternoons, she would find a place on the ridge and look out over the valleys below, where patrols moved like slow thoughts. In that space between wind and horizon, she would sometimes hear a different voice, one not learned from instructors or intel briefings, but softer, older, threaded with pine and thin air, her father's. "Respect life," he'd said. "Always." She had not abandoned that creed. She had merely woven it into a new fabric. Saving lives now meant living with the choices that kept others breathing. The rifle in her hands had become, paradoxically, an instrument of care. When she closed her notebook in the dark and slid it into her pocket, she knew the ledger would grow. She also knew that the only real way to measure what she had become was not by applause, but by whether the list contained more names of the living than the dead. The lights in the compound flickered once, then steadied. Somewhere a helicopter's engine thumped faintly, reminder and lullaby. Sarah lit no victories. She folded her hands and let the cold air move past her face. The mountains kept their secrets, she kept hers. The mission had been done, the hostages alive, the math proved right. She whispered to the dark and the wind and the small list of names in her pocket, "Do it again if I must." The quiet that followed was not empty. It was an agreement, a life measured in choices and the small moral courage to act. Why did every victory taste faintly of ash? The accolades arrived in muted envelopes and tight handshakes. There were orders routing her to missions with names that meant nothing to civilians and everything to soldiers. Direct action, denial and disruption, overwatch for high-value extractions. She moved through them like a professional survivor, calibrating time, adjusting for wind, marking coordinates on a map with a hand that rarely trembled. Yet the aftereffects of success had a way of finding her in the small hours, a radio static that wouldn't stop, the image of a man collapsing in dirt repeating like a skipped film clip, the hollow where pride ought to be. Success made her useful, usefulness made her known, and known invited requests that escalated from tactical to moral. They started calling her for the unthinkable. Missions where the stakes were either lives saved or cities scarred. Operations where the timeline was a single narrow hinge and a single mistake would spill blood into places that could never be mopped clean. She performed each with a surgeon's steadiness and a sniper's calm, because that was what she had been trained to be: precise, necessary, discreet. But the ledger continued to grow. Names Aisha Tom Mark filled a pocket notebook she kept folded beneath her field maps. She had begun adding small notes beside each name: date, location, something human, a laugh, a detail someone had shouted in fear, a small quirk like a chipped tooth or a favorite phrase. The act of writing made each name a person rather than a statistic. It was a ritual that kept her anchored. It also kept the weight visible. There was no ceremony in her progression, only the quiet accumulation of missions. Thompson began recommending her to task forces across theaters. "When it's messy and hot and there's no margin for error, she's the one," he told commanders with a bluntness that stopped questions. Men who'd once looked at her with skepticism now met her in battle with a simple, unspoken trust. That trust meant everything. It also meant she could never confess the tremors that sometimes entered her sleep. One mission stayed with her like a splinter, because it involved a child. They were clearing a village suspected of harboring an IED cell. The intel was thin, but lives were on the line. The assault element moved, and Sarah took her overwatch position on a nearby ridge. Through her scope she watched the village unfold like a diorama: courtyards, a market stall, a scattering of people going about a morning that would soon shift. And then she saw the child. A little boy, perhaps 7, with a blue scarf wrapped around his neck, chasing a goat across a square where a man in loose clothing lingered near a pile of crates. The man was a suspect. The matching of human movement and threat was a trained reflex: patterns, posture, intent. But the child's presence complicated everything. Garcia's voice came soft in her ear. "Targets are within parameters. You have a clear line on the suspect. The calculus should have been straightforward. Remove the threat, save the patrol, end the danger. But the child moved between them like wind through reeds. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the length of the goat's reach and the width of the boy's path. Sarah's hands went cold. Her training suggested a solution. Hold, observe, wait for the suspect to isolate. But the assault element was closing, their timeline compressed. If the man moved or if the boy wandered the wrong way, lives would be lost. She thought of Thompson's reprimand from months earlier. One mistake and people die. She thought of her years as a doctor and how small delays could mean the difference between paralysis and recovery. She thought of the boy's laugh, a sound that reached her through the optic in a way she hadn't expected. Decision-making is arithmetic under pressure. Sometimes the variables are cruel. Sarah chose to do what she had been taught to do in a calculus of care, force the threat away from the innocent. She engaged the suspect, not with a heartless single shot meant to end a life at a distance, but with a sequence that would neutralize his immediate capacity to harm. A shoulder hit, then a disabling follow-through that prevented him from taking another effective action. It was surgical, but it carried risk. The man went down, clutching at his arm. The child ran untouched and collapsed into his mother's arms. The assault team secured the suspect alive, breathing and cursing and defeated. Later, interrogators would extract information that prevented an IED attack on a convoy. The mission was a tactical success. But the man's face in Sarah's scope that day lingered long after, pained, defiant, human. She had aimed to disable, not to kill, but the ethical boundary she held so carefully felt porous. If she could slice into appendages and end threat capacity without killing, did she have the moral right to make that choice from a distance? The question pressed like a thumb into her ribs. That night at a makeshift guard post, Garcia sat with her beneath a fleece blanket. The stars were hidden by haze, but their breaths fogged the air between them. "You okay?" he asked, the question small but full of weight. She exhaled, "We did the right thing." He watched her for a long moment. Sometimes right looks different than we expect. He knew, they all did, these men and women who had been forged to take calculus and turn it into action. But the moral math didn't always balance neatly. That realization was a low-burning ache that sometimes flared into rage. Rage at the systems that created the choices. Rage at an enemy who used children as shields. Rage at herself for having to make the call. There were quieter consequences, too. Her relationships with people outside the theater thinned and then frayed. Calls home became shorter. Friends she had once trusted retreated at the edges of conversations about what she did. Old colleagues from the hospital sent messages that read like tentative questions. Some didn't know how to reconcile the doctor with the soldier. Sarah found herself speaking less about the missions and more about the banalities, weather, logistics, the fine calibration of a scope. It felt like protecting them as much as herself. But the job also brought unexpected gifts, a new kind of intimacy with people who'd earned their place beside her. Soldiers who'd once guarded her with suspicion now confided small, human things, letters from lovers, a recipe for a stolen stew, a photograph of a sister's wedding. Thompson gave her a patched piece of cloth once, the kind of thing he'd likely stolen from a field kit. It meant nothing in relation to medals, but it meant that she belonged. Belonging mattered. It helped her stand up the next morning and do the math again. Then there were the nights when sleep refused to come. She began setting alarms in small rhythms, not to wake for patrol, but to remind herself of other lives, an old patient's name, a nurse's laugh, a father's advice. Small anchors anchored her to who she had been before the title. She didn't allow herself to romanticize the past. She used it as a moral compass. That compass kept her from losing all perspective when the grind of operations flattened every day into a list of tasks. One of the hardest lessons she learned came when a shot missed. It was days after she had been promoted quietly, no ceremony, just a line on a roster nodding her new responsibilities. A village sweep turned into a firefight when insurgents opened on a patrol. She took a shot at a man who had been observed raising a weapon. She accounted for wind, distance, the slope. The trigger broke as it always did, quiet, precise. The man shook, then fell. But instead of the confirmed end of threat, he rolled once and began to crawl away, shotgun slung uselessly to his side. Another element moved in too late. He bled where he crawled, and later, when medics reached him, they reported that the hit had missed an artery by a fraction and infected tissue took hold. He did not survive. The news of the death was not triumphal. It was flat, clinical, and raw. Sarah replayed the shot 100 times, finding no technical failure. The error, if it was one, was in the human assumption that any outcome was tidy. She held that image like a shard, sharp and unavoidable. The lesson was bitter. Intent and consequence do not always align. A clean shot does not guarantee a clean moral ledger. The psychologists on base rotated through with different techniques: guided breathing, cognitive processing, reframing exercises. She went through them with curiosity and then with a biting skepticism. Therapy was a tool like any other. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't, but she kept attending. She went because she believed in doing everything possible to maintain the clarity that her work demanded. As her profile rose, so did the scrutiny. There were panels closed off the record where mission planners asked what she could do to refine outcomes. They wanted metrics, replicable processes, ways to train more people like her. She answered honestly: technical training could be standardized, judgment could not be mass-produced. Judgment, she said quietly at one meeting, is the integration of experience, restraint, empathy, and math. You can teach math. The rest takes exposure to consequence. Her words didn't change the hour-long meetings that followed. But later, a junior sniper approached her at the coffee tent and asked, voice small, "How do you do it? How do you make the shot and sleep?" She met him and for the first time shared something she rarely admitted. You don't. Not at first. You learn to live with it. You learn to make room for what you did and to honor why you did it. Keep your notebook. Keep a name. They both help. He nodded as if offered a map. Their work kept unfolding, relentless. She continued to cross borders, to set numbers on rangefinders, to read wind like scripture. Each mission left its mark, some visible, some buried. The mountain of consequence grew, but so did the small ledger of lives saved. She focused on that balance like an accountant who preferred human sums to abstract profit. One late autumn evening, after a debrief where words of commendation had been replaced by new taskings, she climbed a quiet ridge alone. The valley below was awash of lights, human pockets that required protection. Her breath rose in the chill. She opened her notebook, smoothed the pages, and added a name. Then another. The list blurred into a life lived between edges. She thought of the child with the blue scarf, of the captured man gasping in the snow. She thought of Thompson's quiet nod after the Al-Rashid operation, the unspoken trust that meant more than any ribbon. And she thought, with a clarity that was both fierce and tender, of why she began all of this: to stop the ones who kept arriving at her emergency bay, to prevent another mother from holding an empty seat at supper. She closed the notebook and tucked it into her coat. The wind tugged at her hair. The ridge smelled of pine and cold earth. For a moment, she allowed herself to stand there without calculation or trigger weight. Just breathe, just remember. Her reflection in the dark did not split neatly into doctor and soldier. It was a blended silhouette, lines softened by purpose. The ledger was not a verdict, it was a record. She whispered into the night, not a prayer exactly, but something like one: keep them safe. I'll carry their names. The wind answered by moving a small way through the pines, indifferent and honest. She turned back toward the compound and walked down, steadier than she had any right to be. Why did the mission feel wrong before it even began? No one said it aloud, but Sarah could sense it, the unease that lived in the air like a hum just out of reach. Operations that felt this quiet rarely stayed that way. She'd been reassigned to a new Joint Strike Team, Delta operators, SEALs, and 2 CIA field officers who wore their arrogance like armor. Their briefing was terse, clinical, and heavy with omission. Human intelligence confirms the presence of a high-ranking arms broker, the CIA lead said. Secondary target, encrypted data drives connected to a weapons exchange. Collateral must be minimized. Extraction window, 22 minutes max. They called it Operation Glass Veil. No one mentioned the civilians rumored to live near the target site. Sarah sat near the back of the tent, watching rain streak down the plastic windows. Her rifle rested beside her, sealed in its case. Garcia wasn't with her this time. He'd been reassigned to recovery from an injury. Her new spotter, Lieutenant Kyle Jensen, was young, talented, and overly confident. He had that bright, brittle energy of someone who hadn't yet seen the moral erosion that came with time. He leaned toward her as the briefing ended. "You're the famous Dr. Chen, right? The one who made the impossible shot in Kunar." Sarah gave a small nod, uninterested in legends. It wasn't impossible, just necessary. He grinned, mistaking humility for challenge. "Well, let's make history again." She didn't answer. She just checked her range card one more time. The unease hadn't left. They deployed at 2300 hours under the cover of a storm. Rain washed over the mountains like sheets of glass, blurring every contour. The insertion helicopter dipped through clouds before setting them down in the mud 2 clicks from their overwatch point. Sarah led the climb. The ridge was slick, unforgiving, each step an argument with gravity. Jensen followed close behind, occasionally muttering curses under his breath. "You ever get used to the cold?" he asked through chattering teeth. "No," Sarah said, "you just stop fighting it." By the time they reached the ridge, the storm had thinned into mist. Below them, a village slept in darkness, small homes, dirt roads, faint glows of cooking fires. And in the center, the target compound. Concrete walls, a satellite dish, and armed guards packing the perimeter. Sarah unfolded her rifle and scanned the site through her scope. The scene was quiet, too quiet. She noted heat signatures near the east side, possibly a generator room. 2 guards on the roof, 3 patrolling the outer wall. The team below waited for her signal. Jensen adjusted his spotting scope. Distance to primary, 1,762 yards, wind 6 knots east shifting. Sarah's hand brushed the rifle's trigger guard, but she didn't aim yet. Something in her chest tightened. "Where's the secondary heat signature? You see that?" Jensen scanned. "Looks like civilians, 2, maybe 3, basement level, probably workers." Sarah exhaled. That wasn't in the brief. "Guess they didn't know," he said, shrugging. No, they did know. She felt it. This wasn't a surgical strike, it was cleanup. "Overwatch, you're green," the radio whispered in her ear. Sarah steadied her breath. She began the pattern she'd done 100 times before: visualize, adjust, confirm. Through the scope she saw the first target, a guard lighting a cigarette under the rain's drizzle. Her crosshairs drifted to him, then away. She didn't pull the trigger. Not yet. "Overwatch, we need go," the comms repeated. But she hesitated. Something flickered in the courtyard below, a woman, headscarf soaked, clutching a small child as she crossed toward the main building. Sarah froze. "Command, you didn't mention non-combatants in the AO." Static, then the detached CIA voice. "They're not relevant, execute the plan." Her finger tightened unconsciously on the trigger, the way muscle memory sometimes acts before morality does. Then she pulled it back, off the guard and away. She could see Jensen staring at her, confused. "What are you doing? You have to take the shot." "There are civilians," she said. "We don't have time." "I said there are civilians, Lieutenant." His jaw tensed. "Then we lose the target." "Then we lose the target." The radio hissed with static. Voices barked commands she ignored. Below, the strike team moved early. Someone panicked. Gunfire split the air. Muzzle flashes bloomed in the mist like brief flowers of fire. Sarah snapped into instinct, shifting her rifle, tracking movement, calling targets. 2 on the roof down. South wall, hostile moving. 1,700 meters, wind left 2 mils. She fired once, twice. Her shots were perfect. The world shrank to recoil, silence, recalibration. Then an explosion. A plume of orange fire erupted from the compound's east wall, the generator room. Debris rained into the village. The child's scream, faint but distinct, carried through the headset microphone. Sarah's stomach turned to ice. What the hell was that? Secondary explosion, came the voice on comms, too calm. Target neutralized. Extraction commencing. Neutralized. Sarah tore off her earpiece, ignoring Jensen's shout. Through her scope, she saw what the satellite photos hadn't shown, a storage area connected to the generator room. The civilians had been hiding there. Her breath caught, 2 motionless bodies near the rubble. The operation was successful. The arms broke her dead, the drives recovered, the civilians collateral. And the silence that followed wasn't the relief of completion. It was the howl of something moral breaking apart. The debrief was cold, bureaucratic, deliberate. Target eliminated, said the CIA operative. Minimal collateral considering operational risk. Sarah sat rigid in her chair, rainwater still dripping from her jacket. You knew there were civilians in that building. The operative didn't flinch. Acceptable risk, mission priority was clear. Acceptable, her voice cracked, something human slicing through discipline. A mother and child are dead. He regarded her with the mild condescension of someone who'd long since traded empathy for efficiency. Doctor, you saved lives on a strategic scale. Don't confuse the battlefield for a hospital. Thompson's voice broke the tension. That's enough. He stepped between them, his tone low and dangerous. You ever talk to my people like that again, and I'll show you what confusion looks like. The room fell silent. Later in the hallway, Thompson found her standing alone. You did what you could, he said. She shook her head. That's not enough anymore. He hesitated. Sometimes it has to be. Sarah met his eyes. Then maybe I'm in the wrong line of work. She didn't quit, she couldn't, but something in her changed that night. Her hands, once steady from conviction, began to tremble, not from fear, but from the unbearable precision of conscience. She returned to the range the next morning before dawn. The desert wind cut cold across her face as she took position, loading rounds one by one. The target's downrange blurred and shifted in the heat shimmer. She aimed, fired a perfect hit. Again. She stopped after the 5th shot, lowering her rifle. The pattern was flawless, but the satisfaction was gone. She sat in the dirt, staring at the horizon until the light changed. When Garcia found her days later, she looked older, not physically, but in the way that people look when their beliefs have aged 10 years overnight. I heard about Glass Veil, he said softly. Sarah didn't look up. They called it a success. Garcia sat beside her. And you? She finally turned, eyes hollow but calm. I don't know what success means anymore. That night she wrote 2 more names in her notebook. Not soldiers, not enemies, just 2 people who should have been safe. She didn't write the words collateral damage. She wrote humans. And beneath it, in small letters that nearly tore the page, I am still a doctor, I will not forget. The next morning she reported for duty. No drama, no protest, just quiet defiance, the kind that doesn't shout or burn bridges but endures, bearing weight with deliberate grace. There would be more missions, more orders that blurred the line between mercy and obedience. But something inside her had crystallized. She would still take the shot, but never without remembering what it cost. And in that memory, she found something stronger than orders, the unyielding, silent conviction that someone had to hold the line. Because if no one remembered the price of survival, then humanity was already lost. Why did this one feel like the end? The morning brief came without ceremony. No bravado, no pre-mission jokes, just the low hum of tension, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't move. It was a rescue op, a downed reconnaissance team deep in insurgent territory. 2 survivors confirmed alive, surrounded, time running out. Air support impossible, extraction window closing fast. And Sarah Chen was to provide overwatch, one last mission before rotation. Colonel Stevens kept it short. They're pinned in an abandoned monastery halfway up the ridge. Intel says 30 hostiles in the area. We need you watching the approach. You'll have one partner. Sarah didn't need to ask who. When the tent flap opened, Garcia stepped inside, arms still stiff from his injury but eyes sharp as ever. He smiled slightly. You didn't think I'd let you finish this alone, did you? Sarah almost smiled back. Almost. Guess we're back where we started. He nodded toward her rifle case. And I'm guessing you still don't miss. She looked down at her hands. No, she said quietly, but I miss what it used to mean. They inserted before dawn. The mountains rose out of the darkness like the backs of sleeping giants. The air was dry, sharp, thin. The sky above them bled from indigo to pale gold as they moved. Their overwatch point was a broken cliffside half a mile from the monastery ruins, high ground, narrow, exposed to wind. Sarah lay prone in the gravel, her cheek pressed to the scope, the barrel steady over the drop. Garcia crouched beside her, scanning sectors with the spotting scope, his radio muted except for command bursts. Below them, the monastery looked like a grave, crumbled walls, collapsed roofs, a place abandoned by both faith and time. But the movement inside was unmistakable. Enemy patrols sweeping the courtyard, flashlights cutting through shadow. Sarah adjusted her scope and whispered, range to target. Garcia checked. 1,432 yards, crosswind from the north, 8 knots, humidity's killing visibility. She nodded, I'll compensate. She could feel the tremor of her own breath through the stock, not fear, not anymore. Just gravity pulling every thought to the same point of purpose. The radio crackled. Rescue element en route, ETA 14 minutes, hold overwatch. They waited. The wind whistled through the rocks like old ghosts. Garcia's eyes flicked between the monastery and his rangefinder. You think they'll make it out? He asked quietly. Sarah didn't answer right away. If they move fast, and if I do my job. Still writing names. Always. He smiled faintly. Good, means you're still human. Sarah's reply was barely audible. I'm not sure that's a luxury we get anymore. The first shots came before sunrise. Through her scope she saw the patrol, 6 men moving up the slope toward the rescue route. Too close, too soon. Movement Sector 3, Garcia called. I see them. She steadied her rifle, 1 breath, 2. The reticle found the lead gunman. She fired. The man dropped, his weapon clattering against stone. The others scattered, shouting, returning fire blindly toward the ridge. Sarah adjusted, 3 more shots, 3 more bodies falling before they could find cover. Garcia relayed updates. Ground teams moving, 6 minutes out. She exhaled, resetting her rhythm. Then she saw them. 2 of the hostages moving weakly, supported by soldiers, dragging themselves through the dust toward extraction. 1 stumbled, nearly fell. Sarah tracked them through her scope, her heart tightening as if every step they took pulled something out of her chest. Gunfire flared from the monastery tower. Sniper, Garcia shouted, tower east side. Sarah swung her rifle, eyes narrowing. The enemy shooter was good, steady, disciplined. His muzzle flashed once. A soldier below fell to his knees. Damn it, he's got the angle. Sarah adjusted elevation, range. Garcia squinted, 1,600 meters. She felt the air pressure shift, crosswind rising, unpredictable. Every calculation became instinct now. He's adjusting, Garcia warned. Next shot for the hostages. Sarah inhaled. The world disappeared. Her heartbeat slowed. The rifle's weight vanished. For one suspended moment, there was nothing but the space between her and that tower, the fraction of time where choice still mattered. She exhaled and fired. The sound was swallowed by wind. A second later, a plume of dust burst from the tower's edge. The enemy sniper's rifle fell first, then his body. Garcia grinned. Dead center, you still got it. But Sarah didn't smile. Her eyes stayed on the scope, scanning. There'll be more. The radio cracked again. Rescue team has the hostages. Moving to exfil. Need cover fire. The courtyard below erupted with movement. Dozens of fighters pouring out of the shadows. Garcia called targets. Sarah answered with thunder. Her rifle cracked again and again, each shot measured, deliberate, merciless. When she ran dry, Garcia reloaded without a word. Dust rose in spirals. The sun broke the horizon, the first light of morning streaking across the battlefield. Extraction in sight, came the transmission, 30 seconds out. Sarah's scope found the last remaining fighter aiming an RPG at the departing convoy. She didn't think, didn't breathe. The shot echoed like finality. The rocket veered, spiraled, detonated harmlessly in the open air. Garcia's voice cracked with adrenaline. They're clear, you did it. Sarah finally lowered her rifle. Her arms ached. Her pulse roared in her ears. Down below, the convoy disappeared into the valley mist, alive. Alive. She allowed herself a slow, fragile breath. It should have felt like victory. But it didn't. Hours later at base, the debrief was routine. Outstanding precision, Stevens said. You saved every one of them. Sarah nodded once. At what cost? He hesitated. What do you mean? She looked past him, toward the open door, where sunlight spilled across the floor like something holy. I used to measure success by how many I saved, she said softly. Now it feels like I'm just measuring how many I didn't lose. He didn't have an answer for that. She didn't expect one. That evening, she sat outside the barracks with Garcia, watching the sky bleed into dusk. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, he said, you could stop, go home. No one would blame you. Sarah's eyes stayed on the horizon. And if I stop, who takes the shot when it has to be done right? Garcia sighed. You can't carry the whole war by yourself. She looked at him then, tired but unbroken. I'm not trying to carry the war, just the truth. Later, when the night deepened and the base lights dimmed, Sarah opened her notebook one last time. She flipped past pages filled with names, soldiers, hostages, civilians. Some alive, some gone. Each one a small heartbeat preserved in ink. She turned to the final blank page. Her hand hovered over it for a moment. Then she wrote, 2 rescued, no shots wasted. Then beneath it, smaller, peace maybe. She closed the notebook and laid it beside her rifle. The wind shifted soft, cold, almost kind. She looked up at the stars, and for the first time in years she didn't feel their distance. She felt their silence, vast, unjudging, infinite. Her father's voice drifted back like an echo from another life. Respect life, always. She whispered into the night, her voice steady. I did, Dad, in my own way. A pause, then a small knowing smile. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, she murmured. It simply acts.